situation currently taking place in Myanmar is abominable. There is no safety anywhere, and the world has all but turned its back on an entire people trying to claim their freedom and insist upon their human rights in the face of blatant evil and inhumanity. International media seems to have moved on to the next story, scarcely reporting on this one anymore, even as the horror continues. We at Insight Myanmar podcast find this intolerable, and we stand behind the Burmese people and their courageous effort to live in dignity. This platform is dedicated to making sure that we keep the conversation going, while ensuring these voices continue to be heard. Today's guest is one of those voices, and I invite you to settle in and open up to what follows.
Welcome to our Inside Myanmar podcast. Our podcast reflects a wide range of topics that include meditation, Buddhism, arts, well-being, human rights, Myanmar Spring Revolution and military dictatorship, democratic resistance and emergency situation in country, and much more. Today I'm going to introduce you to a renowned researcher, author, and anthropologist who is specialized in development studies and prison sociology, and who also has many things to share about prison life in Myanmar through his extensive research works and professional experiences. During the podcast, you may occasionally hear noises from flying airplanes, so I hope you will bear with me in this regard. Without taking any longer, let me welcome our special guest, Tomas Martin. Hello, Thomas. It's really great to having you in our podcast. How are you today?
Hello, I'm very fine, and thank you very much for having me. It's really exciting. I enjoy this podcast so much. It's really a well of extremely important stories and information about Myanmar. So yeah, it's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you for supporting our Inside Myanmar podcast. I have read your paper, and it's really, really interesting. And however, before we go further into your research work and talk about general prisons in Myanmar and then your reflections on the paper, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm as you mentioned, I'm a prison researcher. I've done research on prisons from social science perspective for quite some years. I actually started, 23 years ago by accident. Yeah. Uh, I was a young master's student, and I was interested in studying situations where people were under pressure and trying to cope. And I was in India, and a little bit by accident, I ended up doing research in a prison in Tihar Jail in New Delhi. And it was actually a very famous prison, not least because there were an extensive investment in meditation in that prison. So after many debates with prison managers, I ended up doing a study on prison staff. And so I ended up in a prison on a meditation course with a lot of prison staff who had disciplinary issues, who had broken the rules, and so they were sent on a meditation course. So that's where it all started. And since then, I've been very, very interested in better understanding prisons, prison life, the people who live and work in prisons, because the prison is a very influential institution in our societies. It has a lot of impact, but it's often quite ill understood and difficult to access. And there's not so much thorough research-based understanding of what actually happens in prisons and what matters to people in prison, not least in countries outside the US and Europe. So that has been my professional career for more than 20 years.
Yeah, that was very impressive. 23 years.
Yeah, it's a long time.
Yeah, I'm sure you have a lot to say about things you have learned through different prisons throughout the world, and then particularly in the case of Myanmar. Is there anything you would like to go about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can tell you that right now and for the last 6 years, I've been working as a senior researcher in a Danish NGO called Dignity, Danish Institute Against Torture. And this organization where I work, it works to prevent torture and violence, and also to ensure that survivors of torture and violence can access rehabilitation. And Dignity does this on many fronts. We both have a clinic here in our headquarters in Copenhagen. We have many partnerships across the world where we do different forms of intervention to prevent torture and to enhance rehabilitation. We do capacity building, we do advocacy, we do treatment, but we also do research in many aspects of torture and violence. And the research I do is from a social science perspective, trying to understand the dynamics of violence, sort of the underlying dynamics. What are the cultures and the rationales and the conditions that enhance violence, or maybe even can help us to inhibit violence? And here I look at prisons, especially from my experience with prison institutions, because prisons, as is well known, is an institution where a lot of violence actually takes place. So why is that, and how can it be addressed? That's some of the research that I've engaged in. And for the last 5 years, a lot of my attention have been on prisons in Myanmar.
Okay. Yeah, before I've met you like through online. I've never really read a research paper or any articles related to the prison work. And I think what you said is also true. We do not have enough research or thorough research, describing about prisons in Myanmar. And for me personally, when I hear the words like prison, some kind of stigmas are attached to it, and my reflection would be, like torture, adjustment, like oppressions, and it's kind of scare me to read to those paper. But when I read your paper, I I have so many different perspectives, so many new informations that I've never think of before. So speaking of that, and I know that in your research work, you describe prism as prism, and you are trying to look at politics, policies, and rules in Myanmar through prison lens. Well, would you like to go more about that?
Yeah, it's a research project that my colleagues here at Dignity and our partners in Myanmar have been engaged in for some time. We call it Legacies of Detention in Myanmar. And we're trying to understand what we say the history of the present of Myanmar prisons. And one of the catchphrases or sort of headings for our research is to look, as you say, look at the prison as a prism, to see what can our ethnographic analysis, sort of like our fieldwork-based, qualitative, interview-based, and observation-based research, tell us about Myanmar politics, about how imprisonment has been conducted in Myanmar, and what consequences it has for people and for the relations between states and citizens. So we've done a number of publications and research work there, and some of them I've shared with you. I've worked on prisoners' contact with the outside world, which is a key issue. I've worked on issues around prison air, sort of like ventilation, breathing, including meditation actually, and also feelings of warmth and cold in prison, what it meant, how it affects people. I've also written, or beginning to write, at least a history of Mandalay prison, which is a very significant prison in Myanmar history. And of course, we have also, in the course of these years, had some extreme incidents happening in prisons. First, the COVID pandemic, and not least, and the dreadful coup. So this is also something that we have begun to work on. It's not things that we have yet published, but I worked a bit on COVID and also how that has affected prisons in Myanmar. And lately we're trying to get our heads around what happens with prison life and imprisonment during the coup, for instance, by looking more closely at the prison protest that has really taken off for the last 1.5 years. So so a lot of that research is currently in motion. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned this, that you have this very specific perspective on the prison around violence and torture and stigma, and I think that's a very correct observation, because the prison is an inherently violent place. But I'm also happy that you note that you've also sort of experienced a lot of new perspectives. But I think that when you do prison research, you also realize that prison is a very complex place, and it's also a place where people are just living, getting by, are working day in, day out, sleeping, working, eating. So a lot of our research has also been to try to insist on understanding everyday life in prisons and try to get a fuller and better picture of what it actually means to be in a prison, and also to in no way disregard the very explicit violence that takes place, not least recently, but also to be attentive to, you can say, the more subtle long-term effects and experiences of imprisonment. Sort of, when you're in prison, you're often very bored, you're anxious, you can't sleep, you're very close to people with your body that you might not want to. You may not have much of autonomy, very likely not to have physical integrity, and all that together, all these many small cuts, is what I think is very important both to document and understand. And that's one of the reasons why I've also studied this issue about air, which can seem sort of strange and maybe not the most likely topic to look at in prisons. But actually, if you go into a prison, you really feel the smell there, and you also really feel a lot of resonance when you start talking to people who are in prisons, when you talk to them about air, about their really urge for clean air, the way they try to protect themselves against foul air, and how they feel dehumanized by bad hygiene, and also how they really struggle to get comfortable bodily temperatures, and how all that is an integral and also sometimes quite important part of the prison experience. And that's just one of the ways that I, but also in other ways my colleagues, have tried to go into this everyday life of prison in Myanmar, and to see how both the very spectacular and peculiar and extraordinary experiences of imprisonment mix in with very sort of mundane, everyday, domestic experience of just getting through the day.
Yeah. When you talk about air and then, reflecting on your paper, when I first saw the the section mentioning about the quality of air and the smells, and I was surprised to myself that why I'm so ignorant that I've never think about this specific perspective. When I thought about prison before, I know there is no good hygienes, there is no clean water, and then during the COVID, they do not have enough COVID prevention equipment. But the very basic and important element, air, I haven't really thought about it. Yeah, I think it will it's a kind of like a huge element when we talk about this quality of air and how they will affect the life of prisoners there. So please,
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that also, because I think that was also, I mean, I've worked in prison for 20 years before I came to air came to my attention. So in that sense, it's I share your immediate surprise of the richness of this very basic concept of looking at air in prisons. But I think that's also something that we as researchers can contribute with. Sort of, we have the opportunity to take time to actually listen into people. We've done a number of interviews with former prisoners, and in that sense, there is also a division of labor, I think, between researchers like me who can do in-depth, long-term research, and other people who are engaged in prisons. Apparently, and of course, also right now when there is so much need for critical and insistent attention to prison life in Myanmar. I mean, there are people who are documenting human rights violations. There are people who are doing advocacy, but there are also researchers like me who are trying to connect threads across history and to inform our understanding of prisons through theory, and also have an opportunity to look into these more sort of, say, maybe peculiar but still very basic, and in this case, I would at least argue quite telling issues around air. But that's also something that I've tried to research for quite some time, sort of. Um, how we better understand the way that prisons are changing, and also what is the relationship between um, how we know the prison from the outside and how prison can be known from the inside.
Yeah. So why do you think it is really important for people to understand, what's the relations inside and outside the prison world? How would have that make an impact when people understand more about the prison?
Well, I think generally we have to be very insistent on the fact that the prison is part of society. Although you can say the logic of the prison is a little bit, not a little bit, is very much the reverse, right? So you use the prison formally in a society to seclude people, to take them out of the community. But the prison is very much part of society, and we need to understand that some of the dynamics that we see in society are also very prominent in the prison, but often in amplified or accelerated forms. That's also why we at least think it's fruitful to use this notion of the prison as a prism. So as prison researchers, we think studying prison tell us something about how politics and, for instance, in our case, dynamics of reform, state building play out. And so in that sense, it's very important to open up the prison for this kind of examination. But I think it's also very important to try very actively and in practice to keep the prison open to society. And as I mentioned, we've done quite a lot of research on what we in human rights term call prisoners' contact with the outside world. That prisoners have a right to be in connection with their families as far as possible, and a lot of prison research document that the extent to which the prison and the society are in contact, the level of relationships that prisoners are able to maintain, really has positive impact on them and on prison life. So there is also this very, we can say, practical and very direct importance of keeping the prison as open as possible. in Myanmar, we see, for instance, the extreme importance of family visits, of the interaction with families and prisoners in terms of their basic needs. Families bring in a lot of resources to prisoners that they are otherwise not able to access. And in that sense, their contact with the outside world is not sort of only a way to ensure that they are able to maintain family life and relationship with the community that might help prisoners when they're released. Prisoners' contact with the outside world in a country like Myanmar is also extremely important for their survival inside the prison. And families have a big role to play, and families also have many challenges in both financially, emotionally, and has to go through a lot of trouble and many levels of, you can say, extortion and abuse just to reach their relatives inside prison. So this thing about the relationship between the prison and society, both theoretically, conceptually, politically, but also practically, is crucial. And that was also something that in Myanmar, but also across the world, and also in Denmark, where I lived, something that was deeply affected by COVID, when prison visits were either stopped or greatly limited. So that's a key issue in the prison across the world, but not least in a country like Myanmar.
Thank you. So when you look at prisons, I am sure you also witnessed that prisoners are supported to be treated with dignity, and they also have protection from the basic human rights. However, in the reality, that is not the case, and they also suffer a lot of suppression and unjust treatment inside the prisons. So, in the case of Myanmar, do you have any important fact to highlight how prisoners in Myanmar prisons are treated and how they are trying to cope with stress and a lot of challenges that the outsider like me wouldn't be able to understand, but understanding that way make a positive impact towards the society in the future?
I think when you look at human rights violations in prisons, I mean there are so many dimensions, but I mean we of course both see the attack on people's health, their inability to, as I mentioned before, have contact with their relatives. In many situations, they are not accessing fair trial, and they have no opportunity to complain, so they have no opportunity to in any way improve their situation. But what I think is of course well known and also quite rampant in Myanmar is the history of torture and the use of prison as a political a tool for political oppression. So Myanmar has a long history of political imprisonment, which has been, of course, extremely reactivated and accelerated after the coup. Prison life in Myanmar is characterized by overpopulation. Like there's so many prisoners crammed together in very small wards and cells. Solitary confinement is used very aggressively against, especially against political prisoners. And there's a lot of violence in prisons that is somehow you can say the main basis for a lot of the way that the prison is run informally. by strong prisoners who the staff give the authority to control others. So there is definitely a situation of quite significant violations of human rights. But I think it's important, as I think we started off with in this conversation, that there is this harsh, explicit, violent, and very physical suffering in prisons that are very directly and explicitly also targeting political prisoners. But it to me at least, it's important to keep remembering and also to noting the relationship between this form of violence and the general conditions of being locked up, isolated, and challenged on your ways to control your life. It's a very complex picture, I must say, and very challenging one.
Yeah, it's also sad to know that you're talking about there are the imprisonment, overpopulations, people are put in solitary confinement, and lots of violences, and that's applied to general prisoners. So in regards of the criminal prisoners who are on criminal charges and people who are the political prisoners, do you think they are treated differently, or is it the same, or what would you think how the political prisoner will be treated, especially in this context, when military coup happens? Many people, activists, people who involve fighting for the democracy and restoration of human rights have been sent to the prison and under the category of political prisoners. How would you describe their life in the prison?
Well, it's not something that I have studied so directly as some of my other colleagues, but I think that it is evident that political prisoners are suffering very extreme and targeted abuse, as I mentioned, especially in relation to interrogation and arrest. But that happens, we should recall, outside what we call the prison normally, but in the interrogation centers, they're exposed to torture and degrading and inhuman treatment. But they are also, as I mentioned, exposed to solitary confinement in an extreme degree. They're held incommunicado. They're not allowed visits, and they are also subject to unfair trial. But I think that many of the things that these prisoners are experiencing in terms of lack of access to health and other forms of attack on their bodies in terms of food and hygiene, overpopulation. I think that's we have to remember that's sort of the ground tone of imprisonment. That's what many prisoners, if not most prisoners, are exposed to and has been for many years. So there are differences between the roles and the treatment of different categories of prisoners, and political prisoners are of course a significant one. To some extent, political prisoners can also have some resources. They can have a voice. They can have certain strength in their political activism and their communal relations with other political prisoners. And I think that can give them some form of resilience. At least that's what we have learned. But it can also be a burden to carry, and at the end of the day, the prison grinds into everybody, and the violence that you experience, both the very explicit one and the more sort of subtle one, sort of sticks in the body and the mind. So there is a lot of need for counseling, rehabilitation, support, documentation, also to families of political prisoners, but also of other categories of prisoners. And I think that we have to keep in mind that what can be most protective if you are in prison is if you have money, because the prison is an inherently corrupt place, or at least it's a place, it's a marketplace where most things can be bought and sold. So there are many categories of prisoners. I mean, it's too simple to say political prisoners or criminal prisoners or normal prisoners or whatever category you want to say that. So a lot of our research also we're struggling to try to 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 critically question whose prison are we talking about. There are issues between gender and class. There are many different experiences, but I think across the board, if you have money, if you have connections, if you have relationship with strong prisoners or with staff, you can try to put yourself in a position where you can protect yourself, get a better place to sleep, access better food, avoid the most strenuous and humiliating forms of labor. So in some ways, some political prisoners are not able to sort of engage in this sort of marketplace of the prison because they are isolated, and they may also not be interested in that. And some prisoners who are in the common wards are able to negotiate a little bit to improve their situation, both with staff and other prisoners. But it depends a lot on your position. Do you have money? Do you not? Do you have connections? Do you have family visits that can bring in food you can sell? And at the end of the day, if you are poor, if you have no connections, you might not be subject to explicit torture or isolation, but you have absolutely no opportunity to protect yourself. So you will be exposed to very hard situations of hard labor. You have to rely only on prison food, and you will be sleeping close to the toilet in the ward. So in that sense, you can say that there are different categories of prisoners and different forms of suffering. Some are shared, some are very specific. So when it comes to targeted abuse in terms of torture and solitary confinement, I think political prisoners definitely stand out. But I think we have to remember that the prison is also a place of sort of enhanced, widespread violence, and we need to keep our eyes on that too.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me to hear the term marketplace and in the present. This is something quite new to me. And listening your what you just said, it make me realize even more that the life of inmates without the connections and money, how difficult their life would be. And earlier in the podcast, you were mentioned, the family members also struggle a lot, to send the basic needs resources to their family members in the prison. So I could imagine people without money basically will suffer more in the prison compared to their other other inmates in the prison.
Sure, that's definitely a rule of thumb. But as I mentioned in relation to certain targeted prisoners, although they have money, there can be other reasons to keep them under extreme pressure, and that's what's it's a particular vulnerability of political prisoners, of course. So yeah, it's not a good place, the prison anywhere in the world. That's for sure. but I think it's also important to remember that it's also a place where people do live every day. I mean, there are at times almost 100,000 people in Myanmar prisons, and there are people who go to work there every day.
Yeah, I'm glad to know that prison life in Myanmar is slowly improving, and I hope it will be transformed in the future. Um, one Looking back to the conversation, you mentioned, everyday life is happening inside the prisons. People are going there to work. So it's give me the idea of we are now talking about the prisoners inside the prison, but there are also staff who are working in the prison. So do you have any perspective to get life of prison staff in the prisons?
Yeah, I think that's. I'm glad you asked that, because that has been some of the things that I've looked into over the years. As you might recall, I started off my work as a prison researcher, researching staff in an Indian prison, and that was actually a little bit by accident, because I wanted to study how prisoners. In this particular prison in Delhi, I wanted to study how prisoners managed with all the challenges of prison life, and the prison management, they were not so keen to let me talk to prisoners. And after some time going back and forth negotiating access, I was a bit frustrated and said, okay, but then let me talk to staff. And then they said, yeah, do that. That seemed less problematic. But in fact, after talking to the staff and doing research on prison staff, you can get so much information about prison life, and it's it's an important perspective on prison to look at staff, because staff are often in prison longer than prisoners, and what they think about their work, how they carry their work, how they build relationships with each other, with their managers, with people from the outside, and of course with prisoners, matter so much to how prisons are run. So it's a key research area, and it's also, of course, a key area of intervention. I mean, a lot of attention is paid to train staff to do things differently, or to equip staff to do things differently. Um, so um, so I think that it's very important to look at prison staff. I mean, there are even some researchers who have this notion of the prison staff as the other prisoners, because they are in these institutions for so long, and they in many ways share the histories of prisoners. Their work is stigmatized often. They are subject to harsh discipline by their superiors. They live in the barracks of the prison, closed off from society. But of course, they also go home every day and they get paid, and they are with their families. So there are of course also many differences. But it's key to understand prison life to get a better understanding of the role of staff. And also, if you want to change things in prisons, you need to be acutely aware of how staff consider interventions. And often you will find that you can have many good ideas that are developed in other parts of the world, and then you transport them to a place like Myanmar, and if the staff are not interested, if the staff don't understand what's going on, or if the staff working conditions are actually hindering that some of these interventions can be implemented, then they will not succeed. So it's extremely important, but it's been difficult to do research on prison staff in Myanmar because of the limited access to prison staff. You have an opportunity to talk to former prisoners to get a good understanding of prison life. But it's difficult to access staff. They're very suspicious. They are also in a situation where they might be in quite some trouble talking to researchers, especially if it's a foreigner. But we have had some interactions with prison staff, and I think it's very important to continue that line of research in Myanmar also after the revolution. If opportunities arise to get a better understanding of their perspectives of what has happened and what should happen in the future, I think is key.
Yeah, this is interesting. I have many things to ask. What it is like you to be a medical doctor working in the prisons, and what the experience would be like.
Yeah, that's a very good question, but a tricky one, and it can take time to open up. And yeah, it's of course not to have any sort of excuse of the abuses that prison staff are engaged in, but we have to be curious and critically inspect their role, and also to allow ourselves to try to understand what they're involved in. I think it at least traditionally there is a lot of distinction to make between police and prison staff, and I think in the history of Myanmar prisons also the military leaders of the prisons and the prison staff proper, so to speak, inside the institutions. Sometimes they are likely to be in conflict, and sometimes not. And these complex dynamics, I think, are very important to understand. But as I said, it's been very difficult to research, at least so far. We also have to consider whether there are prison staff who are defecting or deserting, and what they can tell us about what goes on. But yeah, that's something we will have to keep focusing on for the future.
Yeah. And you just now you mentioned, it's the relationship between the prisoners and people who are working prison is really important in many aspects. And then, since the staff, prison staff, have been working in the prisons for like maybe some maybe much more longer than other prisoners, they may have some kind of bonds towards certain prisoners. And I was just thinking out loud, in prisons you will also notice from the news certain kind of informations are shared between the prison members. There are real strikes happening in the prisons. So do you see this kind of like relationship between prisoners and prison staff somehow contribute to the better communications on politics in the prisons? I'm not sure I'm getting
Yeah, I
the
think.
questions right.
Yeah, I think what you are getting at is that there is a relationship between prisoners and prison staff that are quite complex, and as I mentioned, also it's different from, for instance, the relationship between police and the public, or between police and the people they arrest and detain. Uh, Prison staff are often very interested in what you could say institutional reproduction. They just want the prison to stay as it always is, and sometimes they do that in collaboration with prisoners, and sometimes they do it by pressuring prisoners very hard, and sometimes they do both things at the same time, maybe often. So there are some relationships there, but they are, at the end of the day, at least most prisoners will say that at the end of the day, they are based on the prison staff's control of the prisoner and the prison, and they are based on the promise of retaliation and violence if the prisoners do not sort of follow uh, the ways that the institution may be able to reproduce itself.
Right, Thomas. At the beginning, you were mentioned you were starting a research on prisons and revolutions. No, prison protests and revolution. Could you talk more about on that regard?
Yeah, it's something that's very much still a work in progress. But of course, after the coup, we have been compelled and propelled to try to follow the developments in the prison and in the practices of imprisonment. And it's obvious that there is acute violence, but that is also, as I've mentioned, it's sort of embedded in an entrenched and long-lasting history of suffering in Myanmar prisons. But there are definitely new things going on. We hear from colleagues documenting human rights violations that torture is and abuse is rampant and in some respects worse and more widespread than before. And of course, very significantly and dreadfully, the implementation of the executions are very significant and also a new development. But one of the things that we are trying to look at is sort of the relationship between the prison and the revolution, both generally and historically, and specifically in relation to prison protests, because there is, you can say, the prison has a particular role in revolutionary history and theory. My colleague Andrew Jeffson and I, we are working with the idea that the prison is considered, on the one hand, and sort of, and both an incinerator and an incubator of the revolution. So on the one hand, the prison is where revolutionary actors and protests are being quelled, people are being locked up and even killed to destroy the revolution. But the prison is also a place where there is opportunity to collect revolutionary actors and to produce revolutionary action and spirit. I mean, throughout the history of Myanmar prisons, there has been a lot of attention to the prison as what some former political prisoners call the big school, where there has been a certain kind of quickening of revolutionary spirit and education between political prisoners. So it has this double role, the prison and in the revolution. And as you might know, in sort of in an iconic revolutionary moment is to storm the prison. We know it from the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. So there is something about a particular place the prison has in the revolution that I think is extremely important to follow and document. So we are trying to look into the protests that are taking place in prisons since the coup, where prisoners are organizing different forms of protest. What role do these protests play? What kind of reactions are the prison staff and the military? What are they doing to clamp down on these protests? And when and how do they occur? Sometimes they occur, at least at the beginning, very much in correspondence and resonance with key events on the outside, sort of anniversaries of the 888 or the 2222. So there were these protests, but there are also protests sometimes occurring when for instance, when political prisoners are reacting strongly against, you can say, institutionalized abuse by strong prisoners who are delegated by staff to control other prisoners. We've seen some protests sort of flaring up when political prisoners are not accepting that kind of abuse. There's also been protests, especially in the early days of the revolution, against COVID and lack of medical treatment, where prisoners have experienced their fellow prisoners simply dying and not receiving treatment. So there is, I think, a very important area of research here to better understand these protests, to see what role they play in the revolution, and also to document the reactions, especially the abuse. We've seen killings in relation to these protests, and also how they develop over time. They seems to be changing from the beginning of the revolution. We saw a lot of communal protest, mainly anchored around CDMs. Now there are different actors in the prisons, PDF prisoners, and there are different ways that these protests play out, we expect. And there's also, I think, in relation to this issue of documentation, there is also, you can say, a tussle for the narrative about what goes on. I mean, the authorities would say there is a riot, whereas revolutionary actors would call it a protest. The authorities might claim that they had to react harshly because prisoners were trying to escape, whereas protesters would rather state that there was no escape attempt. It was a peaceful demonstration in the prison against dreadful conditions. So there are very intense things going on here. Also, the relationship between, I think, the prison staff and the military. The military often enter the prisons in relation in connection with protests and start firing. So this is something that we will follow closely in this period, and I think it's very important to document what goes on with these protests.
Yeah, I'm personally really exciting to read this research paper when it come out, because it's really intrigued me. I think it would be really important document for the others to find out and know as well. Yeah. So concerning the topics that you have covered in the research and things that we have discussed today, is there any other recommendations that you would like the audience to know to improve the current prison conditions and to reflect on the revolutions and its implications on the prisons and society, and also type of support that you would like to recommend in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I think in the short term, I think there is definitely it's so important to keep documenting what goes on in prison. I think that's important in any prison context, but it's of course of accelerated importance in this particular situation of abuse and the way that imprisonment are used to quell the revolution and pursue the people of Myanmar. So we need to continue to document what goes on in prisons, and a lot of very capable actors are striving to do that. So I think the continued support to this documentation effort, I mean, both to make sure that we are gathering key information about what goes on for the future, but also to ensure that we can support advocacy efforts, and also to simply help families to know what goes on with their loved ones. I mean, there is a long tradition which is particularly linked to sort of a military mindset of thinking of the prisoner as an enemy of the state that has to be hidden away, and there is has been a long tradition of in Myanmar of withholding information to families and also other actors who are interested in getting the lawful information about where are their loved ones, what happens to prisons, what happens to prisoners. So prisoners are held incommunicado, and this you can say it's a way to weaponize mis or disinformation, and so there is a strong need to struggle against that and to make sure that we know what goes on in prisons as far as possible. There is a need to support legal aid of prisoners. I mean, there is very limited, if non-existent, opportunity to access any form of fair trial for people in the criminal justice system in Myanmar. To some extent, this has been the case for some time for many groups, but it's especially bad now, and especially for political prisoners, of course. But still, there is an opportunity for legal actors to improve our knowledge about what happens to prisoners, and to support prisoners, although they cannot in any way guarantee or support their fair trial in practice. Of course, continued humanitarian support to prisoners, what try to get medicine, food, and other forms of basic needs, made them available to them through their families and other contacts. And as I mentioned before, advocacy to make sure that what goes on in Myanmar prisons are not forgotten and have, as far as possible, political impact. But I think it's also important, and now I'm speaking more as a researcher, to keep the attention that is now on prisons in the long term. I mean, to not forget about the prison once, as we hope, the revolution succeeds. That there is an insistence on changing prison life in Myanmar, and that the revolution should also be directed to improving the prison also in a very deep and fundamental way. This is very complex, and it cannot happen overnight, of course, but there is a need to, I think, to continuously try to make society less punitive, and there is an opportunity in a moment like this to think about why we punish and what punishment does to people, and try to do this better. And I think, as I mentioned before, one of the key ways to do that is to open up the prison and to punish less. So I think that's also, in the long term, a very important task for the people who are now trying to look towards how a new relationship between states and citizens in the future Myanmar can be developed. So don't forget the prison, because it has remained very bad for many years, and now there is attention to how bad it actually is and how bad it can become when it is very weaponized, and when the violence in prison is amplified as it is now. So there is definitely a need to change that fundamentally, if in any way possible in the future.
Thank you so much, Thomas. You share a great perspective about prisons and things that we need to consider for in the future as a long-term endeavor. So this is a great conversation, and thank you once again spending your time with us, sharing these great insights. And I hope our audience will find this conversation as interesting and fruitful as I am.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure, and it's tough. It's a tough topic to discuss and also to work with, but it's also, I think, important and worthwhile to keep trying to improve on how we administer our relationship with the prison in practice and in theory and in the future. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you just kind of zone out or skip ahead till it's over. But I ask that if you're taking the time to listen to our full podcast, that you also take the time to consider our spiel. Some may assume that producing a 2-hour episode wouldn't take much more than the conversation itself. But so much more goes into it. In advance of the interview, our content team reviews the biography and relevant works of the upcoming guests, and we discuss the best way to use our limited time together. After the interview is completed, the raw audio file is sent to our sound engineer who shapes it into working order. A single episode can take several full days of solid production work in the studio, which is carefully coordinated with our content team to ensure smooth listening. Further edits and post-production magic bring the eventual episode into your ears, along with extensive written descriptions of each interview, which we publish on our blog and social media. Many of these steps require an outlay of funds in some way or another. We hope that each episode informs you about the ongoing crisis, and if you find it of value, we also hope that you might consider supporting our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Whatever, Yarananga, Unyana, Dadu, Yadan, Zadamana, we got a Besayana, Besayo. Oba, Yarananda, Dayananga, Yaranaya, Dayanam, Boda, Yaranam.